So the basic summary of this session in code print and easy to download Proton folder attached necessarily denotes what? So we'll start with Dan Harmon's December 1st, 2019 podcast. What is preposterous? The first day of COVID and his last day of podcast that is in actual logistics of intelligence logic, not consulting data science, spurious correlation garbage, back reinforcing, incapable to assume anything in topology outside of, you can't form probability in any way with that methodology. And so we throw it out because it's nonsense as a methodology. Of course it's sardonic foreknowledge. We logic his networking specifically to one way of Kevin Bacon. We play a little one way of Kevin Bacon game with Epstein's black book flight logs, generalistically. And then we see Berkeley receives a $252 million grant fund to build a compute cluster for CRISPR and DNA inspection right during 2020. So Dan Harmon equals UCB Berkeley, Earwolf, etc. So extreme foreknowledge of event in sardonic imposition of comedy, and then dumped into that data system ill-gotten DNA samples. See the Chinese investment in 23andMe and other genealogy websites is related to this. Investment in plasma and blood collection centers, etc., all related. So dumped into that and then sidechain mined in the CRISPR ideation. See No Time to Die, why that is inherently insanely nefarious. And so we logic metasystems equals Berkeley in data flow. OpenAI equals metasystems in data flow. OpenAI equals Microsoft in data flow, very basically server to server. OpenAI equals XAI in data flow, server to server. And all of these dump every night to a Swiss trust, uninspectable in entity attached, but a conglomeration of in data dump, what China industriously dumps to as well and has inspectability to. And all of these entities have at least 5.9 to 9% investment via BlackRock Capital, connecting the spiderweb network interdomain of the United States and China back end as the middleman consigliere BlackRock Capital acts as between China, VC, CCP Capital, and these corporations, and controlling them necessarily at the data layer. And we assume having amalgamation inspection of that data when it hits the Swiss repository every night. So Netflix, Vox Media as well, Gates to, of course, Microsoft that we established in the September nonsense and preposterous as well, just like the Harmon podcast, using actual basic logic instead of data science, spurious correlation, can't form proper probability logic, as that being preposterous, right? And of course, not random, the next month a pandemic occurs and costs trillions of dollars, $16 trillion in total. Okay, so what have we left out? So I'm printing basic code where you can see the data flow in a visual form. Press start, record, inspect volume of packet flow, general, between these corporations that present as what? Separate. They present as separate corporations, but we make the analogy, it's like Detroit, two separate car makers like Ford and Chrysler or something. They make this a car that looks different on the outside, but you look inside, it has all the same interior components. And the engine is exactly the same and the same planned obsolescence model. So that is very basic antitrust and racketeering, RICO, etc. presenting as hydratically, Hydra you see in Marvel, but the same exact entity at the data layer effectually and in real time. So in any other corporate situation outside of tech, that would be what? That's to maintain autonomy and legal immunity. All right, so yeah, it's kind of silly to assume legal immunity. Why? Well, just because you make the excuse, what would be the excuse for this real-time interconnectivity? Functionality? What functionality? So when you have a Google account and you go, say, I want to sign into this website with my Google account instead of setting up an autonomous account, that's different, isn't it? Yes. What's the difference between that and this? Well, you're functionally stitching the data layer yourself, right, to other corporations, entity, on your behalf, and could otherwise set up accounts autonomously and separate, segmenting your data footprint and them not necessarily communicating cross in any given situation. So this conglomerate operates how? In real-time synchronous outside of a necessity of functionality interdomain of each of them. All right? So why does XAI need to constantly reference OpenAI's data set? Can't they train on their own user base and data set available? So it's logic, well, if both AIs are training off the same data set concurrently, as OpenAI cross-communicates to X, just like X cross-communicates and studies off of OpenAI. But forward face, you see Altman is versus Musk, right? Obfuscated and optic, but at the data layer, the same ass entity. So, Meta the same way to Berkeley, to OpenAI, to Microsoft, to XAI, and all dumping into Swiss every night. China paying for the Berkeley operation, and through BlackRock Capital, seeded consigliere style through BlackRock to all these corporations, controlling them by proxy at the data layer, harvesting in Swiss every night, and all of them meshed together in encrypted mesh hyperspace, and then all at once and all together dumping to the Swiss. That's then amalgamated and inspected by China, we assume. So that includes genetic topology data extracted nefariously during an intentionality, not an accidental lab leak. China, COVID. We've logic surgically that is the case past any probability of it not being the case. So it's intentionality at all fronts, and who's the little Italian man? No, it's not just one little Italian guy. You know, there's other bigger Italians. It's silly to say that Anthony Fauci did this whole thing, right? And all these corporations, right? It's probably China, right? Because that's kind of and then through BlackRock, and then intentionally, obtuse from the endogenous, territorial pissings of the United States is a functional continuity of conditioning off of baseline intentionality in infrastructure design to one end that's good for Chinese circuiting and controlled by proxy, generalistically over long form time with plausible deniability because presents hydratically, but not at the data layer, right? So you see volume flow of packets directly surgically in spiderweb interlocking without you, like I said, actively stitching your Google account to these separate entities, or your X account to OpenAI, or your OpenAI whatever to X, or your Microsoft account. So OpenAI just runs on Microsoft. And you see Gates in the precursor September Netflix special, Vox, Netflix, And who paid for that? So that's in the session too. And so you see in a precursor sardonic intentionality. So that's very important. The first thing I stated was the Harmon thing, right? So you see a sardonic, as if comedy, imposition of foreknowledge to a 7 million death print on purpose. Extraction of DNA data, inspecting it, harvesting it for CRISPR application, we can assume for forward nefarious application of, say, surgical seed, no time to die, logistics, Chinese. And they perfected monkey cloning in 2016. So in another session, I'll logic what? In 2016 to 2017, not just these corporations, but 222 individuals show all of a sudden mechanical deviance off of organic general motion and speech topology baseline that they expressed for, say, 20 years prior to 2016 to 2017. And then all unilaterally start to have 3% deviance in general fluid dynamic motion and speech topology, cadence, and silence motion, generally. So what does that speak to? Are they all clones? No. That's what I thought at first. They're clones. They have to be. What just happened? Because the general motion inspection, 3% deviance, and all of a sudden, and China just did that. What's going on, right? No, it's Neuralink. They've been chipped. So that's our plausible explanation. As their high rotating apex macro nodes in infrastructure strategically attached to the tech and extraneous good for China entourage of corporations, and necessarily that data organism that we've been talking about leading up to this pi data organism infrastructure amalgamation across multifacetous, Fortune 500 companies, international. All of the sudden glitch 2016 to 2017, expressing 3% deviance under across the domain of 222 individuals between 2016 to 2017. So there's it's not a science fiction cloning thing, but we take the SR-71 Blackbird logic of 30 years in use case, and then all of a sudden you know about it in the late 70s. So how long has Neuralink been logistically and surgically functional for action at a distance control of neuronal function? To elaborate, say in a reductionist fashion of communication interlocking and directive inject motioning, as well as the side effect motioning complexly autonomic, where an AI can forward inspect visual data of interviews from pre-2016 to post-2017 and see mechanical interlocking 3% deviance mechanical cross-domain of all of these individuals pinpointed that I'll forward motion in another session. So all this amounts to what? I should have reestablished myself. Why can I talk about all this and not care? So this is a $25 trillion just the today hydratic, and that's not including all of those 222 individuals necessarily, 5 or 6 or 7 of them denoted as these corporations in question for today's session. So see why Scotty can talk about all this. Yeah, go study it in another session. I'm not going to get into it here. Anyways, so here's the session onlay for everything I just talked about, starting with the conclusion first. Logic, probability, and the network summary, etc. Then the onlay, and after the code print for the very basic .exe visual inspection for the layman, I go through the technical summary, and then for the layman politician that's not tech inclinated like a lot of them are, which is fine, and not everyone's obsessed with computers. That's great. For them to understand, and the visual exe where you can just hit start, and it starts inspecting packet volume flow between these corporate entities and, Swiss repository, Berkeley, China, attached via the Swiss. Once it hits Swiss, then it's like in an uninspectable storage bank, and then Alibaba, etc. Those AIs dumping there too. You can imagine amalgamated and mined, all of them, and then dumped to China. Backflow, of course. Why would they all be conglomerated? That's the entity motioning this directive of formulation of all these hydratic corporations presenting as separate, but not at the data layer a separate entity. And so basic conclusion is what? You can't do that. Basic antitrust laws already, I was going to draft something called data organism, legal, but you don't need it. It's just very basic, like racketeering, avoiding, antitrust legal motion by operating in a hydratic fashion by presenting as if separate entity, et cetera, et cetera. So that repository is for what again? If you take one down and don't assume the complex, it just goes glitch and flows to the other, and it keeps on running, right? That's why it's called Hydra from those Marvel movies. So here's the session.